They dragged a black man out of a luxury bank lobby like he was garbage left on a marble floor. No explanation, no apology, just judgment in their eyes and smirks on their faces. Because to them, his skin said everything they needed to know. He stood there in a tailored suit, holding documents they refused to read. Surrounded by wealth, he was denied access to, not because he didn't earn it, but because they decided he didn't look like he belonged. No one offered help. No one questioned the humiliation. They laughed, dismissed him, erased him. But what they didn't know was that the floor they forced him to step off of would soon be the one he stood over. This is not just a story about injustice, it's a reckoning. If that first sentence made your jaw tighten, you're going to want to see how this ends. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from and what moment hits hardest as you watch. Like, subscribe, and comment below. We're just getting started. Zaire Ellison pushed through the tall glass doors of Sutton and Key's private banking, the kind of establishment where legacy mattered more than liquidity, where the wood-paneled walls whispered generational wealth, and the marble underfoot had been polished, not just for shine, but for intimidation. He wore a muted gray suit, tailored but not flashy, shoes buffed to a professional sheen, and in his left hand, a sleek briefcase that bore no logos, only quiet intention. His walk was calm, composed, deliberate, the kind that came from decades of discipline, not display. But the moment he stepped inside, the air shifted. Conversations near the welcome counter dipped in volume. Eyes, subtle and not, turned to him. Not out of admiration, not out of recognition, out of confusion, suspicion. At the concierge desk, a young woman named Brienne adjusted her blazer, looked up from her screen, and let her eyes rake over Zaire without a smile. She leaned slightly to the side, her voice low, but not too low, speaking to the man beside her. Her words weren't meant for him to hear, but she didn't care if he did. That suit's gotta be rented. Probably here to drop off a resume, she murmured, smirking as she reached for the desk phone. Zaire reached into his coat, calmly presenting a printed confirmation. 9 a.m. appointment, Executive Suite, Financial Advisory Division. His voice, when he spoke, was measured. I'm here to finalize the transaction on the Rainshore Trust portfolio. Brienne didn't touch the document. Instead, she pressed a single button beneath the desk. One red light flickered under the marble lip. 2 minutes later, a figure emerged from the side hallway. Gerald Wincombe, floor operations manager, ivory skin flushed with morning caffeine and self-importance. His smile was already formed as he approached, and it wasn't a kind one. "Good morning, sir," he said, without warmth. "The executive suites are by appointment only." Zaire held the paper forward again. "I have one. 9 o'clock. Gerald didn't read it. He didn't even look down. He scanned Zaire's face, his posture, then glanced at the briefcase. "And who are you here on behalf of?" Zaire hesitated for only a second. "Myself." Gerald's smile sharpened. "I see." He turned slightly, angling his body between Zaire and the deeper corridors of the bank. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to wait outside while we verify. This is a secured client area. Your presence is disruptive." Zaire narrowed his eyes, not in anger, but disbelief. "Is this how you treat confirmed appointments?" Before Gerald could reply, a security guard with a neck like a pillar and the pace of a man used to confrontation stepped into view. Gerald didn't wave. He didn't need to. The timing had been planned. The message was clear. Zaire glanced over his shoulder. People had started watching. A couple in designer trench coats looked up from their phones. A man in a tan overcoat whispered something to his wife. Zaire turned back to Gerald, voice even. "This behavior, this decision, are you sure you want to stand by it?" Gerald didn't blink. "If you're unwilling to leave voluntarily, we'll have to involve the authorities." The guard took a step forward. Zaire could feel the tension behind him swelling. Somewhere near the teller windows, a woman laughed. A sudden, sharp sound followed by a hushed whisper. "He's got to be kidding," one of them said loud enough for him to hear. "Walking in here like he's royalty or something." Zaire turned to the guard, nodding once. "I'll step out. But I'd like your name and the name of the person denying my appointment." Gerald gestured toward the doors. "That won't be necessary." This isn't personal, just policy. Outside, the sun hadn't yet reached its full strength, and the sidewalks chill bit into the collar of Zair's coat. He stepped back, far enough to be clear of the entry cameras, but close enough to see inside. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Through the double-glass doors, he saw Brienne lean toward Gerald again, both of them half-smirking, the kind of laughter born from certainty that they had won something. He stood there, unmoving, for 6 minutes. At one point, another man, a white man in jogging gear, strolled through the doors with a reusable coffee cup in hand. Brienne smiled warmly, gestured toward the private elevators, without a question. Gerald gave a subtle nod, the kind you'd give a friend's son or a board member's nephew. Zair's jaw flexed once. He stepped back further. The building rose like a fortress behind him. But this wasn't his first time facing this. The humiliation wasn't new. It was just more refined here, more casual, wrapped in manners and marble. He took out his phone, tapped a contact. His thumb hovered over the green call button. Then he stopped. Not yet. Not like this. When he turned to walk away, he passed a small cluster of employees in branded navy coats. One of them, young, red-haired, sipping a thermos, paused and gave him a look that held a trace of confusion, maybe even regret. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Zair walked slowly, without hurry, but not because he didn't have a destination. Because he was thinking, calculating. He had not raised his voice. He had not challenged the security. He had not reminded them that the Rainshore Trust transfer was valued at over $2 billion, that he was the sole executor of the portfolio, that the account had been approved not just by Sutton and Keyes, but by the Federal Reserve Advisory Board. Inside, the morning foot traffic had begun to thicken. Executives with folded newspapers under arm, consultants in thin black coats, even a retired senator known for his portfolio in the energy sector moved easily through security. Zair waited exactly 11 minutes before re-entering. When he walked in, Gerald was gone, but the front desk had rotated staff. Brienne had been replaced by a young man with a polished smile who glanced up at Zair with the same confusion Brienne had shown earlier, but without the open disdain. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, another presence swept in behind Zair, a broad-shouldered white man in a gray-blue coat, hair slicked, wearing the confident fatigue of someone used to signing documents worth 7 digits before lunch. The receptionist's attention snapped away from Zair as if by instinct. He greeted the man quickly, confirming a name and pulling up an appointment file. A handshake followed. Zair was left standing beside them, documents still in hand, not even acknowledged. The man, whose name tag read Mr. Kellner, had arrived without a scheduled time, yet was immediately invited through the brass-handled doors behind the reception desk. The concierge buzzed in approval, motioned to a suited assistant who appeared almost instantly to lead the man down the hall toward one of the private consultation rooms. Zair, meanwhile, remained at the front counter, ignored again. His voice was calm when he addressed the receptionist. "I returned for the 9 o'clock with the Carrington portfolio team. There was a delay earlier. My name is Zair Ellison." The young man gave a brief nod, typed something into the computer, squinted, hesitated, then said that someone would be with him shortly. He didn't offer a seat. He didn't offer water. He didn't ask for identification. He just turned to another task, as if the conversation were over. So Zair stood and waited. Again. A few clients shuffled by, glancing at him the way people glance at things out of place, like a dripping pipe in a luxury bathroom, like a misplaced lunch tray at a gala. One woman tugged her purse tighter to her shoulder as she passed. Another man adjusted his scarf and shifted direction, giving Zair a wider berth than necessary. The security guard near the entryway was different from the one that had escorted Zair out earlier. This one, heavier set, eyes constantly scanning the room, wore the body language of a man who didn't enjoy ambiguity. His gaze locked onto Zair and never quite let go. When their eyes finally met, the guard didn't nod, didn't look away. Instead, he sneered. "You waiting for something?" the guard said, not kindly, not formally. Zair answered evenly. "Just for my appointment." The guard grunted, looking Zaire up and down. "You sure you're in the right building?" Zaire didn't respond. The guard smirked. "You look like somebody who missed the shelter line this morning." Zaire's grip tightened around his briefcase handle. His face remained still. The insult had been clear, blunt, cruel, and meant to provoke. But Zaire had learned long ago the power of restraint. The weapon wasn't in the words. It was in the silence that followed. The longer he stood there, the more apparent it became that this wasn't a delay. It was policy. Not written, not spoken, but performed. 15 more minutes passed. Clients came and went. He watched two tellers exchange glances in his direction, whispering behind semi-transparent partitions. One pointed toward him subtly with her pen. Another chuckled under her breath. One of the assistant managers finally walked by and saw Zaire standing near the desk. She approached not to greet him, but to tell him bluntly that loitering in the client lobby was prohibited. He explained his appointment again. She narrowed her eyes and asked to see confirmation. He handed it over for the second time that day. She looked at it like it was written in another language, then walked away without comment. No offer to call upstairs. No clarification. Just absence. A white client who had arrived 15 minutes after Zaire exited the consultation suite with a handshake and a parting smile from a banker. Zaire watched the door swing open, revealing the same room he had been scheduled to use. The client caught sight of Zaire and looked confused for half a second before walking past with the indifference of someone who had never needed to think twice about why things happened smoothly for him. The receptionist glanced up again, pretending to just now remember Zaire. He told him again, someone would be with him soon. Zaire said nothing. The silence in the lobby began to take on weight. Some clients noticed it, how one man had been standing for nearly an hour without a seat, without a greeting, without even a nod of basic service. The few who noticed didn't speak. Silence was safer than risk. A clock chimed behind the main pillar, echoing faintly through the lobby. 11:23. Zaire hadn't moved. The security guard snorted again. "Still here," he muttered loud enough for nearby staff to hear. Man must really like the air freshener in this lobby. A few heads turned. One teller bit her lip to hide a grin. Zaire didn't react. He could feel the heat rising behind his ears, but refused to show it. The briefcase in his hand contained documents that would shake more than just the marble beneath his shoes. But it wasn't time yet. Not until they showed exactly who they were. Not until the veil of civility they wore so comfortably dropped entirely. By 11:40, another client had entered, and like those before him, the man, white, silver-haired, reeking of familiarity with this space, was welcomed within moments, led away with efficiency and warmth. Zaire remained unacknowledged. The security guard, who had been shifting between boredom and cruelty, stood with his arms crossed, leaning now on the same pillar near the lobby's edge. He eyed Zaire with renewed interest, as if boredom had given way to appetite. He spoke to no one in particular when he said, "Man starting to look like a fixture. Maybe we should bolt him to the floor." Two tellers laughed, not loudly, but just enough. Zaire shifted slightly, rolled one shoulder to ease the tension building across his upper back, and glanced toward the far corner of the ceiling where a small, circular camera dome was positioned. It had been following him earlier. He'd noticed the red diode blinking faintly. Now it was dark. No blink. No rotation. No indicator of function. Not an accident. He turned his gaze slowly back toward the front desk, noting the way the receptionist now deliberately avoided eye contact, fingers moving across the keyboard as if inputting nothing. A female staffer passed nearby, carrying a slim laptop in one hand and a tablet in the other. As she moved behind the receptionist's desk, she leaned in and whispered something. The receptionist nodded. Zaire watched as her hand slid beneath the counter again, but this time the screen above her shifted, only briefly. A status light on a small console flicked from green to amber. Zaire understood the interface immediately. He had worked with surveillance security in another life for another system. That light wasn't a reset. It was a pause. They were disabling footage in the lobby. A sinking cold settled in his gut. Not fear, not even anger. Recognition. This was premeditation. The insult had been sanctioned. Someone upstairs knew what was happening and had no intention of intervening. Zaire breathed in and turned slightly to check the elevators. No one was coming. The security guard now stepped off the wall and approached, slower this time, more deliberate. "Still haven't figured out, huh?" he said. "No one's coming for you. You people always think making a scene's gonna buy you respect. It doesn't." Zaire didn't flinch. He didn't move. He let the words fall, cataloged the body language, calculated the weight. That's when it happened. The guard, emboldened by silence, by the lack of consequence, reached out, not fast, not violently, just arrogantly, and slapped the file folder from Zaire's hand. The papers fanned across the floor like scattered feathers. One floated across the polished marble before stopping near the base of the concierge desk. The slap echoed louder in the silence than it had any right to. Zaire remained still for a beat. Then another. He bent down and collected the papers, slow, precise, fingers trembling only slightly. He did not speak. He did not react. From the far edge of the lobby, one of the junior assistants had seen it. A girl no older than 23, holding a tablet against her chest. She froze for a moment, eyes wide, then ducked back behind a column. Zaire caught the motion in his peripheral vision. Someone had seen it. That would matter later. Not now. Upstairs in the executive suite, a ping sounded in a private messaging thread between Gerald Wincombe and a senior manager named Clay. The message came from Gerald's tablet, face flushed red and jaw locked as he typed. "He's still here. Standing like he owns the damn place." The reply was instant. "Just keep it clean." The language wasn't coded. It was exact. Policy dressed as prejudice. Zaire didn't have access to those messages yet, but they existed. And like every system that believed itself untouchable, it would eventually trip over its own arrogance. Back downstairs, the receptionist clicked open a customer management program, pretending to search for an appointment Zaire had never been allowed to claim. She saw the flag beside his name, a small red mark labeled DNC. Do not contact. Do not confirm. A deliberate blacklisting. And still, she pretended to look. Still, she offered nothing. The guard returned to his post, satisfied with the display. Zaire stood straight once more, smoothed his coat, gathered the last page from under a chair leg, and placed the reassembled folder back into the briefcase. He looked again to the darkened camera dome. Still offline, still blind, but it had seen him earlier. And that recording, the first half, before the footage dropped, would still be accessible if you knew where to pull it. Zaire didn't call after her. He didn't move. He simply noted the absence of acknowledgement and added it to the growing catalog of intentional omission. The clock behind the reception desk chimed noon. The sound carried with it the chill of finality, like a door slamming shut in a quiet room. The receptionist picked up the phone and made a call, her voice low but deliberate. Moments later, another man emerged from a corridor on the left. He wore a red tie, a badge that read Operations Supervisor, and a smile that was neither friendly nor forced. It was clinical, controlled, the kind of smile that comes with protocol rather than instinct. He approached Zaire without haste, with the confidence of someone who believed he held the authority of the building in his palm. His name was Maxwell Sorrell, and within 10 seconds of arriving, he made his position clear. He raised his voice, not enough to shout, but loud enough that every conversation in the immediate area faltered. "Sir, this area is reserved for clients with active appointments," he said, scanning Zaire from head to toe, voice carrying across the lobby like a public service announcement. "We cannot allow you to linger in priority zones without authorization." Heads turned. A man by the espresso station lowered his paper. 2 women paused mid-conversation. The receptionist stopped typing. Zaire did not respond immediately. He remained still, offering nothing but silence in return. Maxwell continued. "Unless you have a current engagement confirmed with the department lead, I must ask you to leave the space immediately." There was no confusion in the phrasing. No offer to assist. Just removal disguised as regulation. And then it happened again. A new voice entered the mix, not a staff member, but a client. A white man seated near the front of the lounge, early 50s, cream suit, wedding ring gleaming under the light, tapped his palm flat against the small marble table beside him, loud enough to punctuate the moment. "I don't feel safe with this man standing here," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes were locked on Zaire. He's been pacing, standing, staring. What kind of bank allows this kind of presence in a secure wing? The effect was instantaneous. The accusation, though unsupported, carried the weight of social inertia. Eyes darted back to Zaire, now framed not as a man waiting with dignity, but as a threat, as something foreign, something unstable. Maxwell seized the moment. He gestured toward the nearby security guard, the same one who had taunted Zaire earlier. "Escort him out," he said. "We'll follow up once verification clears." The security guard, already itching for movement, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward with calculated authority, hand hovering near Zaire's arm, though he didn't touch him yet. "Time to go," he muttered, voice firm. Zaire looked around the room once, slowly. Every face was watching now, some out of curiosity, some out of disdain, none with empathy. One young teller, seated at a side desk, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly uneasy, but said nothing. Zaire didn't argue. He didn't resist. His hand clenched tighter around the handle of his briefcase, and he turned toward the door. As he walked toward the exit, his shoulders square, his pace calm, the whispers began. Low, sharp, serpentine. A woman near the concierge desk leaned toward a friend and said, "He probably wandered in. Doesn't look like he belongs in a place like this." Another man commented, "It's always the quiet ones. You never know what they're planning." Behind the desk, Maxwell tapped a tablet screen and added a note to the internal log beside Zaire's profile. "Escorted for disruptive behavior. Potential risk. Flag for central review." Outside, the air had warmed, but Zaire's chest felt colder than it had that morning. He stood just beyond the front entrance, watching a flow of people entering and exiting. Each face was unbothered, unconcerned, as if nothing had happened. As if what had just unfolded inside had been a simple policy matter, not an act of public condemnation. What disturbed him wasn't the ejection itself, it was the way it was choreographed. It had all happened without resistance, without question, as if everyone had rehearsed the roles in advance. The manager who elevated his voice at just the right moment. The client who had leapt at the opportunity to frame Zaire as a threat. The guard waiting for permission he already expected to receive. The receptionist who had stopped acknowledging his presence 2 hours ago. It wasn't a single act of bias. It was systemic obedience to an unwritten order. It was not the act of one person with prejudice. It was a network of participants performing an ancient dance, one perfected over generations, masked by policy and polished floors. Zaire walked down the steps, past a hedge trimmed to corporate perfection, and paused at the curb. A driver waiting at the valet station glanced up from his phone and looked away quickly. Zaire made no phone calls. He didn't need to. His transportation had already been arranged. He stood alone for several minutes, breathing slowly, recalling each face, each word, each non-action. His anger didn't flare. It settled. It rooted itself deep. What they had given him was clarity. What they had shown him was the full anatomy of their machine. The sidewalk outside Sutton and Keys had begun to bake under the early afternoon sun, but Zaire felt none of its warmth. The chill from inside still clung to him, not from temperature, but from the clarity of his alienation, like a film of rejection that couldn't be wiped off. He did not call a car, nor did he wander. He remained standing just outside the perimeter of the building's automatic doors, where the tinted glass reflected his image back at him with clinical detachment. The security guard inside had not looked away, his eyes continuing to track Zaire with the gaze of a hunter, ensuring his prey remained beyond the border. For 10 minutes, Zaire stood motionless until finally, another man approached him from the street, tall, dressed in a navy windbreaker with a Sutton and Keys logo stitched above the chest pocket, carrying a clipboard and a clear plastic water bottle. He identified himself as an assistant liaison from operations and asked Zaire if he was still waiting to be seen. The question was not meant to assist. It was bait, an invitation for Zaire to appear desperate. Zaire replied calmly that he had not yet been acknowledged properly, nor had his appointment been cancelled in writing. The liaison responded with the rehearsed line of corporate neutrality. Please proceed to the service annex. We will re-evaluate your credentials. Zaire was led not through the grand double doors, but around the building's side entrance, where a narrow corridor led to a less polished reception hall with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs bolted to the tile. There were no chandeliers, no concierge desk, no velvet ropes or security guards in suits. This space was built for people not meant to be seen. A junior employee with flushed cheeks and a twitching eyelid pointed toward a narrow hallway and said, "Just down that way, there's a bench." Zaire followed the direction and arrived at a metal bench fixed to the wall, just beneath a thermostat screen. The hallway was cold, the tiles underfoot chilled by the building's overpowered ventilation system. Zaire sat. He was told someone would be right with him. The door closed behind the staffer, and silence reclaimed the corridor. Time passed in slow motion. 1 hour, then 2. Zaire remained seated, hands folded neatly across his briefcase, eyes forward. No one entered. No one left. The only sound was the occasional hum of the vent and the faint shuffle of feet far away in some part of the bank not designed for visibility. At one point, a janitor appeared with a cart full of cleaning supplies, glanced at Zaire, then at a list pinned to the side of the cart, and without saying a word, turned around and left. Zaire's phone remained in his coat pocket. He did not reach for it. He did not text. He did not scroll. He waited. Eventually, the door opened again and a new figure entered. A young man in his 20s, wearing an intern badge and a smug expression of undeserved superiority. He carried a styrofoam cup and walked with the arrogance of someone raised to believe authority was a birthright. As he passed Zaire, he made a show of stumbling slightly, his elbow jerking outward, the cup tipping just enough to send a cold splash of water directly onto Zaire's lap and jacket sleeve. The impact was precise, clearly rehearsed. The young man gasped theatrically. "Oh no," he said in a sing-song voice. "I'm so sorry. That was totally an accident." Zaire looked up at him, expression calm, but locked in a stare that held no amusement. The intern hesitated, clearly unnerved that Zaire had not reacted with the expected frustration or complaint. He began to step away, but Zaire's silence seemed to follow him, unsettling and unwavering. The intern disappeared through another door, and moments later, the faint sound of laughter echoed from behind the wall. No one came to clean the spill. No one offered assistance. The damp fabric of Zaire's suit clung to his thigh and wrist, the chill from the water amplifying the cold in the hallway. More time passed. A low mechanical rattle vibrated through the walls as the building's air system cycled. A few staffers walked by at intervals, none of them stopping. One glanced at Zaire and quickly turned her eyes back to her tablet. Another adjusted her lanyard and walked faster. Each step was a choice to ignore. Each refusal to speak was a calculated submission to the rules of exclusion. Zaire, still seated, began to feel the ache of his spine pressed against the metal backrest, the cold of the tile beneath his feet seeping upward into his bones. But he did not move. He did not shift or fidget. He simply waited. Eventually, after nearly 2.5 hours, the same liaison from earlier returned. He carried no documents, no tablet, no explanation. Only a brief nod and the phrase, "You can return to the lobby now. A manager will be down shortly." Zaire stood, his joints stiff but his posture intact, and walked back down the hallway, past the same tiles, the same fluorescent lights, the same door where the intern had vanished. When he reached the annex exit, the security guard from earlier was waiting, arms crossed. The liaison didn't speak to the guard. He merely gestured with his head and stepped aside. Zaire walked into the lobby once again, the sound of his shoes muffled by the plush carpeting now underfoot. The transition from tile to carpet felt symbolic, an invisible line between tolerated and welcome. But even now, back in the main lobby, no one acknowledged him. The receptionist continued typing. The clients continued sipping espresso and signing forms. And from the corner of the room, the young intern reappeared with a fresh coffee in hand, whispering something into the ear of a peer. They both glanced at Zaire and smiled. He was allowed to stand, yes, but not to exist as an equal. He was seen, yes, but only through the distorted lens of suspicion and discomfort. As time continued to grind forward, the quiet murmurs of staff and clients filled the air again, a return to shallow normalcy that masked the rot beneath. A woman in a navy blazer approached from the inner offices, a mid-tier manager by posture, if not by title, with a clipboard and a thin-lipped expression of bureaucratic obligation. She stopped 3 feet in front of Zaire, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if examining an animal she didn't fully trust. Without any greeting or context, she gestured to the documents in his hand and said, "Do you read English fluently?" Her voice was flat, condescending, edged with a false concern that had been sharpened into a blade. Zaire's eyes did not blink, his posture remained unshaken, and he handed her the same papers he had shown hours ago. She took them without meeting his gaze, flipped through the pages with rapid disinterest, then chuckled, not out of amusement, but in dismissal, as if the weight of his printed appointment was meaningless in her hands. "You brought these," she said with a snort, waving the folder slightly. "From where exactly? A FedEx kiosk?" Her tone suggested sarcasm, but her eyes glinted with malice. She returned the documents without care, allowing the top sheet to slip slightly from the stack before muttering something under her breath and walking off toward the rear offices. Zaire bent to straighten the page, a motion he performed without complaint, though each time he reached to correct what they had scattered felt like a reaffirmation of the role they had cast him into, one of cleanup, one of compliance. But it didn't end there. Minutes later, another staffer appeared, this one whispering briefly to the receptionist while glancing at the floor where Zaire had been standing. The receptionist gave a short nod and pressed a button beneath the desk. A few minutes after that, 2 janitorial staff entered the lobby through the west corridor, one carrying a rolling mop bucket, the other holding a spray bottle and a yellow caution sign. They didn't speak to Zaire. They didn't look at him. Instead, they walked directly to the space where he stood and began spraying the floor around his shoes, the pungent scent of ammonia rising in thick, invisible curls. Zaire stepped aside slightly, and one of the workers motioned with a hand, signaling him to move further. No words were exchanged, but the implication was deafening. They were cleaning where he had stood, as if his presence had somehow soiled the pristine tiles, as if he had left behind something unclean that needed to be wiped away before the next high-net-worth individual walked through. The yellow sign was placed exactly where his shoes had just been, and the mop was drawn across the marble in slow, deliberate lines. Each pass of the fabric against the stone was like a whispered accusation, each flick of the spray bottle a reminder that in this place, Zaire did not merely lack power. He lacked hygiene in their eyes. From a nearby conference room, a pair of bankers emerged in conversation, one of them pausing briefly when he noticed the janitors. He looked at Zaire, then at the floor, then back at Zaire again, his mouth tightening into a thin smile that tried to be polite but failed. "We've had some unusual traffic today," he muttered to his colleague. "No big deal, but we should double the cleaning rounds this week." His voice wasn't meant to be loud, but it was heard, and Zaire heard it clearly. Another staffer walked by, nodded toward the caution sign, and commented, "Must have been something sticky." Zaire had not moved from his new position along the side of the wall, though now he stood on carpet instead of tile. He said nothing, and no one asked if he needed anything. No water, no clarification, no apology. The janitorial staff finished their passes and left as quietly as they arrived, leaving behind a wet shimmer that gleamed beneath the fluorescent light and the yellow sign that marked the area where a man had stood, not where a spill had occurred. The image burned into Zaire's mind, more humiliating than any shout, more degrading than any slur. The institution had spoken without words. At one point, a teenage intern passed by carrying a tray of espresso cups meant for the partner's suite. He glanced at Zaire, paused and whispered, "Still here," not with concern, but with amusement. Before Zaire could respond, the boy turned and disappeared through the gold-trimmed doors of the premium client lounge. From behind the front desk, the receptionist tapped something into her keyboard again, glanced at the lobby camera, which had now resumed blinking red, and then looked away. Zaire checked the time on his wristwatch. 3 hours had passed since his original appointment. He had not been called, not been addressed meaningfully, not been offered the decency of basic acknowledgement. Everything they had done was designed to degrade him in increments, to wear away his dignity through practiced omission, calculated indifference, and subtle ritual. Around him, the flow of foot traffic remained unchanged. Clients came and went without interruption. Staffers moved about with studied detachment, and the weight of his presence remained unacknowledged by everyone except the surveillance cameras, which had resumed their quiet, mechanical watchfulness, blinking in unfeeling rhythm from above. The receptionist tapped keys in monotonous bursts, occasionally lifting her head to scan the lobby, but never long enough to meet Zaire's eyes. Then the glass doors rotated with a low mechanical sigh, and a man entered. He was dressed in a plain navy jacket, no tie, no badge, no announcement. His shoes were matte leather, his hair closely trimmed, his expression unreadable. He walked past the concierge without slowing, past the security desk without a glance, and moved directly toward Zaire with the kind of composure that suggested neither haste nor hesitation, only certainty. When he reached Zaire, he paused, observed him for a breath, then asked softly, "Are you Mr. Zaire Ellison?" Zaire nodded once. The man said nothing more, only offered a short nod in return before stepping back, producing a slim earpiece from his jacket pocket, fitting it calmly into his ear, and speaking into the small mic clipped near his collar. His tone was neutral, efficient, the language concise and direct. "He's here. Proceed." What followed happened in quiet, calculated precision. The receptionist's phone lit up. Her eyes widened slightly. She picked it up, muttered a short acknowledgement, and stood without a word. The security guard's radio buzzed once. He turned his head toward the back offices. From a hallway beyond the gold-trimmed doors, 2 senior staffers emerged, whispering urgently to one another, their clipped heels and polished loafers echoing as they moved with sudden, unfamiliar tension. A message was being relayed, not loudly, not publicly, but through the kind of internal channels reserved for emergencies of structure, not safety. A junior administrator walked briskly past Zaire with a phone pressed to her ear, murmuring, "We need a full board presence now. Yes, the executive floor. Immediate." 3 minutes. That was all it took. In 3 minutes, the climate of the building shifted entirely. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but in those subtle, unmistakable cues that only trained eyes recognized. The sudden stiffness in posture, the rushed realignment of paperwork, the rapid disappearance of smirks from the faces of managers who just hours earlier had performed acts of degradation with relaxed confidence. A woman from legal entered the lobby and walked directly to Zaire. She extended a hand, gave her name, then said, "We've been expecting you, sir. The boardroom is ready." No explanation was given to the receptionist. No apology was issued for the delay. No one questioned why this man, hours earlier treated like a trespasser, was now being escorted by the director of corporate compliance. Zaire followed her through the executive corridor. Each step he took echoed differently now, no longer weighed down by humiliation, but driven forward by inevitability. The door at the end of a hallway was opened for him without announcement. Inside, the boardroom had already filled with 10 individuals, some still seated, some half risen in response to the summons. None of them had seen his face before. None of them recognized the man in the gray suit, still damp at the cuff, still bearing the silent residue of 4 hours of orchestrated cruelty. But every one of them had seen his name. Zaire approached the head of the table, placed his briefcase gently atop the polished wood, unlatched it with a single click, and removed a folder no thicker than half an inch. He set it down before him, opened it to the signature page, and looked up at the room. No need for theatrics. No need for explanation. The documents contained therein finalized the majority transfer of controlling interest in Sutton and Keyes Holdings, purchased quietly through a shell network of corporate partnerships, executed over a period of 11 months, and concluded 72 hours earlier with full authorization from federal oversight. The man they had removed from their lobby, whose presence they had scrubbed from tile and air alike, now stood as their new principal shareholder. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply issued one instruction: clear the floor. Everyone with a managerial title or above. Effective immediately. No one moved at first. The legal director glanced around the room, then repeated the order. You are required to comply. As of this morning, Mr. Ellison's authority supersedes your roles, pending full transition. The resistance did not come from defiance, but disbelief. One by one, the board members stood. Some left quickly. Some paused, hoping for contradiction. None came. Gerald Wincombe's name was read aloud by the director of legal, followed by the word terminated. A second name followed, then a third. As the doors closed behind them, Zaire remained at the head of the table, his eyes following no one, his focus never shifting. Only a few department heads, untouched by the prior corruption, were present, sitting in tense stillness, while Zaire stood at the head of the table, hands loosely resting on the closed folder he had brought in, his eyes unreadable, posture unwavering. The legal director sat to his right, flipping through her own printed copy of the final acquisition documents, her silence both respectful and deferential. No one spoke, not even to ask what would come next, as if they all sensed that what followed was not a presentation but a reckoning. Zaire reached into his briefcase once more, retrieved a small black device the size of a key fob, pressed a single button, and the lights in the room dimmed automatically while the screen at the far end of the wall came to life with the Sutton and Keyes emblem. A quiet chime followed, and then the screen faded into grainy footage, lobby surveillance timestamped from just 6 hours earlier. At first, the footage showed the entrance, a normal day of clients arriving, staff greeting, a familiar rhythm of corporate routine. Then Zaire appeared on screen, walking into frame, briefcase in hand, posture dignified. The boardroom remained silent as they watched his journey across the floor, the moment he was intercepted by Gerald, the dismissive exchange, the slow arrival of the security guard. The footage had no audio, but it didn't need it. Every gesture was damning, every sneer, every deliberate act of erasure. The screen shifted angles, showing a second camera from above, capturing Zaire being escorted toward the door, the guard's hand hovering near his shoulder, the casual disregard on the receptionist's face. Zaire tapped the device again, and the footage skipped forward to the side corridor, where the tile floor and cheap metal bench waited. It showed him seated alone. It showed the interns spilling water, the janitors scrubbing the floor, the yellow sign planted like a flag of conquest. There were gasps from one or two members still present. Others sat pale and rigid, their hands frozen near the handles of untouched coffee cups. Then Zaire pressed the device once more, and the feed changed. This time, it wasn't building surveillance. It was sharper, clearer, angled from below. A hidden lens. The footage showed Gerald standing too close, his mouth moving in clear patterns, the words easy to read on his lips. The words "you people" appeared more than once. The term "don't belong" was repeated. Even without audio, the message was unmistakable. Zaire let the video play until the exact moment when the camera feed cut, the very instant someone had disabled the building's internal system. Then he turned off the projection. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was not just thick, it was condemning. Finally, the head of compliance, seated at the far end of the table, shifted in her chair and asked softly, "Will you be pressing charges?" Zaire's reply came without delay. "We will be conducting a full audit. Everyone who participated will be held accountable. This building will no longer be a sanctuary for bigotry dressed in procedure." As the meeting ended, Zaire did not leave the boardroom. Instead, he asked for 3 personnel files to be retrieved and brought to him: Gerald Wincombe, Maxwell Sorrell, and Elspeth Carrington. Within the hour, they arrived. Inside Gerald's was a performance evaluation from the previous year that had flagged him for inconsistent treatment of non-priority clients, along with 3 informal complaints filed by clients with names that suggested non-white backgrounds, each of which had been dismissed internally without investigation. Zaire reviewed the records without surprise. Inside Maxwell's file was a history of flagged interactions that had never escalated to HR, but that had been noted privately by 2 junior staffers. Elspeth's file, however, was thicker. In it were internal reports from the Financial Review Division, revealing that over the last 18 months, she had initiated discretionary holds on over 40 accounts tied to African American or immigrant clients, citing potential risk review as justification. When asked to provide documentation for those holds, she had replied with vague language about data inconsistencies. Most of those holds had delayed transfers, altered credit access, or in several cases, directly interfered with property purchases and business expansions. These were not isolated incidents. These were patterns. Calculated ones. Zaire requested full transcripts of internal communications, and by late afternoon, the audit team retrieved a backup of Slack-style chat logs from the internal messaging system used by the senior team. With these in hand, Zaire prepared a private memo to be sent the following morning to the full executive team and department heads. It would be accompanied by a summary of footage, audit findings, and a mandatory invite to a new mandatory anti-discrimination compliance overhaul. But he didn't stop there. That evening, he met with the board's outside counsel, requesting a review of all terminated account histories from the past 5 years, cross-referenced by race, gender, and neighborhood. He demanded not just structural change, but institutional exposure. The room buzzed with anticipation. Cameras adjusted focus, lights shifted angles, and voices murmured across the chamber as every person present sensed the announcement would not be routine. On stage, a long glass podium had been positioned beneath the corporate logo, and behind it stood 3 chairs, only one of which would be used. Zaire took his place without fanfare, nodding once to the director of communications before she stepped aside, giving him the floor. His address was short, factual, and unapologetically blunt. He confirmed the acquisition, acknowledged the administrative shift, then began reading from a printed statement. It detailed the discovery of deliberate discriminatory practices within the upper ranks of the institution, citing documentation, time-stamped footage, and message logs. He named names. He did not flinch. He spoke of Gerald Wincombe's removal, of Maxwell Sorrell's dismissal, of Elspeth Carrington's pending legal action. He stated clearly that the culture which permitted these abuses would be dismantled piece by piece, not behind closed doors, but in full public transparency. He concluded by stating the one truth that underpinned it all. There is no institution, he said calmly, too large to be held accountable. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward. Questions spilled over one another like waves crashing at the same time, but Zaire remained poised. He took only one question, offered only one televised answer. When asked how it felt to expose and dismantle the system that had humiliated him just 24 hours earlier, he replied with the words that would later echo across news segments, quote cards, and digital screens nationwide. I didn't ask to be treated like royalty. I only asked to be treated like a human being. That clip spread across media platforms not because of its drama, but because of its clarity. The footage of Zaire walking through the bank lobby, of him being ignored, insulted, and ultimately revealed as the true owner, became not only a symbol of systemic failure, but a lesson in composed resistance. In the hours that followed the press conference, Sutton and Key's internal inboxes were flooded with messages from both outraged customers and apologetic staff. Some praised the reckoning. Others questioned how long it had been covered. Clients with long-standing accounts began requesting reviews of their portfolios, demanding transparency audits. A few high-profile accounts quietly transferred to competitors, not because they disagreed with Zaire's actions, but because they feared what else might be uncovered. Internally, the legal department expanded its scope. 13 managers from regional branches were placed under investigation for patterns echoing those discovered at headquarters. 5 resignations came within the next 48 hours. An emergency compliance audit team was deployed across every department. Zaire did not oversee each one personally, but he authorized every step, signing off on full cooperation with federal regulatory agencies. In parallel, external investigators from the Office of Financial Conduct launched a formal inquiry, issuing subpoenas for all internal communication logs between upper management and client services going back 5 years. The firm's public relations team scrambled to contain fallout, but Zaire vetoed any statement that included phrases like isolated incident, regrettable lapse, or unintentional oversight. He insisted the truth be stated plainly, without varnish, without excuse. Outside the walls of the bank, the public took note. The same clients who had once walked past Zaire without acknowledgement now reposted clips of his statement with captions like "finally" and "about time." Some who had witnessed the original incident anonymously submitted testimonies confirming what the cameras had missed. A woman who had once laughed near the concierge desk wrote a confession online saying, "I saw it happen. I did nothing. I don't want to be that person again." Meanwhile, employees who had played even passive roles in the discrimination, those who had snickered, who had turned away, who had stayed silent, began to feel the backlash ripple toward them. One receptionist name surfaced in an exposé, her past chat logs showing patterns of mocking client names based on ethnicity. She was dismissed within the week. Another intern who had been overheard saying "still here" in reference to Zaire found himself blacklisted from 2 internship programs before the end of the day. Not all consequences came from above. Some came from the very clients they had once treated as lesser. High net worth customers who shared Zaire's background began withdrawing assets in protest unless clear action was demonstrated. Grassroots groups released scorecards ranking financial institutions on racial equity, and Sutton and Keyes dropped several tiers overnight. Despite this, Zaire refused to play the victim or the hero. In a follow-up interview, when asked if he intended to punish those responsible further, he answered, "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring no one else gets dragged across a marble floor and told they don't exist." Still, the fallout was not limited to public image. Behind closed doors, some of the now unemployed executives began receiving subpoenas. The Department of Justice, now involved due to formal complaints filed through the Equal Opportunity Commission, opened a review of discriminatory lending practices, and every flagged decision signed under Elspeth's authority was re-evaluated. A class action suit loomed on the horizon. The final days of the quarter arrived not with ceremony, but with quiet recalibration. Sutton and Keyes, once a fortress of exclusion masked in prestige, had begun its transformation, not through press releases or grand gestures, but through the tangible absence of arrogance in the air. The polished marble floors still shined, the elevators still chimed politely, the espresso still steamed in porcelain cups, but the tone had changed, and the people had changed with it. Zaire no longer needed to occupy the boardroom daily. His directives were carried out through trusted teams. His presence felt in every new hire policy, every client equity report, and every recalibrated performance metric. The institution he now owned no longer centered around maintaining its image, but around justifying its existence. In the weeks following the public fallout, a letter was submitted to Zaire's office by hand, not through internal mail or courier, but delivered personally by a man who once held the authority to eject clients on nothing more than assumption. Gerald Wincombe stood in the outer waiting room for 45 minutes before being called in, and when he entered, he did not sit. He stood in front of Zaire with both hands clasped, not with arrogance, but with vulnerability. He stated that he was not there to plead for reinstatement, nor to defend himself, but to acknowledge the harm caused. He explained that in the days following his termination, he had been contacted by former clients, staff members, even his own children, all of whom had seen the footage. Their reactions had shattered the comfortable narrative he had built for himself, the one where he was just following policy, where he had been protecting institutional standards. He now understood he had been protecting his own reflection and rejecting the humanity of others. He ended with a single statement: "I used to believe my intentions protected me from blame. But now I understand that intentions mean nothing without awareness. I was blind and I chose not to see. Now I choose to see." Zaire listened without interruption, then nodded once and told him that accountability, when chosen rather than forced, carried weight. Gerald did not return to finance. Instead, within 6 months, he accepted a role as a speaker with a national social equity organization, delivering talks at universities and corporate forums, not as an expert, but as a case study in learned humility. His most repeated line, captured in one of his sessions, was simple: "I was never taught to examine my power. I was just told I had earned it." That was the first lie. Other stories emerged too, quieter but just as meaningful. One of the receptionists, the very woman who had ignored Zaire repeatedly during his visits, submitted her resignation in an email that acknowledged her complicity. She wrote that her silence had been louder than any insult, that her failure to act had stained every professional credential she carried. Instead of transferring to another financial firm, she enrolled in a nonprofit education program and began working as a liaison for immigrant families seeking banking access. Her first community session was held in the very same building she had once dismissed others from. Change came not only through policy, but through presence. New staff arrived, many hired not just for experience, but for insight. Zaire mandated that community engagement be part of every leadership track. Every partner was expected to spend 1 day each quarter in underserved neighborhoods, not as a photo opportunity, but to listen. One senior advisor, formerly skeptical of these reforms, later confessed that what he heard in a single conversation with a displaced entrepreneur had altered his understanding of lending more than a decade of balance sheets ever had. Zaire himself did not chase recognition. When asked in a major industry interview how he defined success now, he answered, "Success is when your silence isn't feared, when your presence no longer feels like a disruption." His words were quoted, analyzed, debated, but they stood firm, unedited, because they resonated not just as critique, but as a standard. The building changed too. The space where Zaire had once been forced to sit cold and alone on a metal bench was repurposed into a client outreach wing. The bench was removed and replaced by a long mahogany table surrounded by chairs of equal height, where walk-ins were greeted by name, not number. The janitorial closet down the hall was turned into a break room where staff could share meals, fostering interaction across departments that had previously operated in silos. The lobby cameras were no longer tools of intimidation, but transparency. Footage was audited not to catch clients, but to ensure dignity was maintained. In time, Sutton and Keyes gained back some of the clients it had lost. Not all, and not easily, but through earned trust, not persuasion. Their quarterly report showed a dip, but their community reputation rose, and in the long term, that proved more sustainable than any aggressive acquisition strategy. On the anniversary of the acquisition, Zaire stood once more in front of the same building. He looked up at the gold-plated nameplate above the door. It still read Sutton and Keyes, but inside it no longer served only a name. It served a purpose. A group of interns passed behind him, laughing, unaware of who he was until one of them stopped and turned back. "Are you the guy from the video?" she asked, a little unsure. He smiled faintly and replied, "No, I'm just a guy who never left." The end. If this story moved you or made you think, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. We'd love to know your thoughts. What moment in the story struck you the most? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every one.